Okay, I'm ready.
Alrighty.
Hope I can do this.
Oh, have you like written it all out?
No, I just want to make sure that I'm covering the I'm really bad at this, man.
Yeah.
Maybe you'll have to start doing it.
Well, actually, all of this little banter here, this is all going in. So the point
Oh,
is,
wow, that's pretty cool actually.
that's going to be great. Anyway, I think this is a really good episode, Shuddy, that we just recorded right now. I think
I liked it a lot.
I think it
Yeah.
was, it was
So,
really fun.
yeah, and we have a very special guest. He's controversial.
Indeed.
His name is Sohrab Ahmari. So he joined us, and I'd say that he's one of the leading Catholic writers and authors who's talking about some big issues now. He is the op-ed editor for the New York Post. His previous book was called From Fire by Water, My Journey to the Catholic Faith. And his new book, which is the reason that we're talking to him about all these issues, is called The Unbroken Thread, Discovering the Wisdom of Tradition in an Age of Chaos. We went almost an hour and a half talking about all things liberalism, tradition, Catholicism. So, because it's a bit of a longer episode, we're dividing it into two parts. Part one is available for everyone, and part two is for subscribers. Part two is quite interesting because we go into some unusual territory, including on how Sohrab has gained more respect for Islam since his conversion to Catholicism. And I hadn't really heard him talk about that before. So I really enjoyed that. If you are interested in subscribing, you can do that by going to wisdomofcrowds.live/subscribe. And we'll also include a link to subscribe in the show notes if you're interested. Not only will you get these bonus episodes almost every week, you'll have full access to our Friday essay, the weekly column that Demir and I write every week, as well as other paid content. So I hope we hope you'll consider joining us and becoming a member of Wisdom of Crowds. And with that little intro, now on to the main attraction, our conversation with Sohrab Ahmari. Hope you guys enjoy it. Well, the natural. So, do you want to do like a natural, like me and you, and then I'll just.
Yeah.
Or,
I mean, this is it already. This is the
oh, that's already
unnatural
what.
natural. So yeah, go ahead and start.
That's already what we're doing. This
Yeah.
meta thing,
Don't
and
feel bashful.
and you're probably going to hear a third voice very shortly. We're very excited to have him, Sohrab Ahmari, who is the author of a new book. It's called The Unbroken Thread, Discovering the Wisdom of Tradition in an Age of Chaos. The book just came out. We'll include a link in the show notes. Highly recommended. And I know that by now I've been saying this every time we have someone with a new book, where I'm like, you really, really should get this book. I'm going to say it again because this time it also happens to be true, which will make it interesting the first time we have a guest where I'm not as excited. And then you guys might be able to notice. But yes, so we're very happy to have him. And so welcome, Sohrab.
Thank you, guys.
And maybe just to get started and frame the book a little bit and what really caught my attention and also surprised me a little bit, which is, Sohrab, you're not a stranger to controversy. Even by Twitter standards, I would say you're fairly controversial, and sometimes, you get in Twitter debates and controversies and crises where people attack you a lot. And so sometimes
Debates is a gentle way to put it.
exactly, gentle. Yeah. So, but what's interesting about this book is that when I was reading it, I was expecting controversy, and it is certainly controversial in certain ways, but it's also a book, and I mentioned this to you in one of our previous conversations, it's also a book that I can imagine well-meaning, reasonable liberals reading in good faith and maybe appreciating certain parts of it, even someone like, say, Barack Obama, because Barack Obama did include, one of your friends, Patrick Deneen, his book, Why Liberalism Failed, and Obama liked that. So I can imagine Obama liking this one, or at least parts of it. So it's not necessarily a polemic, but there's also a lot of richness that I think cuts across partisan and even ideological lines. If anyone has concerns or criticisms about the current liberal order, they'll probably find something appealing in what you have to say. So I'm curious, maybe just tell us a little bit about what you were trying to do with this book and maybe the level of controversy that you were aiming for and what you're really trying to accomplish. What do you want readers to take away?
Sure. Thank you for all the kind words about the book, Shadi, and also been very kind to the book on Twitter as well. You're absolutely right that the book will surprise people who are primarily familiar with me as a polemicist and a disturber of the intellectual peace. The reason for that is because this book is a project of posterity. I began writing it when my son Max was 2 years old. He's now four, and it's a book I wrote for my son, basically out of a sense of anxiety about the kind of person that our civilization will chisel out of him. As I recount in the book's introduction, I spent my teens and 20s as almost sort of the perfect subject of liberal order. I immigrated to the United States from Iran. I happened to end up in a trailer court in northern Utah. And then within a decade, I'm catapulted to New York City, where I'm working on the Wall Street Journal opinion pages, later transferred to London. I marry a wife, a woman who's also an immigrant, although she's Chinese. And so, I'm a partaker of and beneficiary of precisely the sort of centrifugal forces of liberalism, of its barrier dissolving capacities. And yet, when I'm confronted with the fact, as a new father, the fact that I'm about to have a child who will grow into a man, I'm suddenly filled with anxiety, and all the gratitude I might have for liberalism's ability to maximize my choices aren't enough to allay my fears about what kind of a man my Max will be. And so the framing device in the introduction might be worthwhile to talk about. I begin with St. Maximilian Kolbe, who is my son's namesake. He was a Franciscan friar who was canonized as a saint because he chose to lay down his life for a stranger at Auschwitz in 1941. And so I begin with that Max, and then I imagine what kind of a Max my Max will be when he's at the same age as Maximilian Kolbe. And it's not that I'm worried that he'll be like, I don't know, sort of manifestly an economic loser in our zero-sum economic war of citizens against citizen or class against class. Chances are he'll inherit his parents' elite status. Rather, what I'm worried about is he'll just be kind of this TED Talk spewing, shallow creature who just seeks after money and has spent his whole life, quote unquote, trying to keep his options open. What that means is that he actually hasn't exercised his freedom, because if you always keep your options open, you don't actually ever reduce your freedom from potency to act. You don't actually do anything. And I contrast that with the vision of freedom represented by Maximilian Kolbe, which is a vision of a profound vision of freedom as of self-sacrifice, of self-denigration, of apparent surrender. Of course, that apparent surrender is Maximilian Kolbe's triumph in Auschwitz, of all places. And I worry that the account of freedom that my son will inherit, the one that tells him that freedom means keeping your options open and having maximal choice from among contraries, is an impoverished one. And so I want to tie my Max to something better than I myself can offer him, and that something is tradition. It is this deeper account of freedom that spans many traditions, in fact, not just his own Catholic one, the one that I'm bringing him up in, but others as well. And so the book becomes my effort to try to introduce my Max and hopefully the reader to this other account of freedom. And because I'm not a theologian or a philosopher, I'm just a journalist and a storyteller, I structure the book around 12 unasked questions, each of them poking holes in one aspect of our contemporary ideology, or questions that our civilization thinks have been resolved or are no longer worth asking because of the advances in science and technology, whereas I actually think they're still pertinent to a good, truly free life. And then I explore each of those through the life of one great thinker. Some of them are very kind of predictable, I guess, St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, John Henry Newman, the great English convert in the 19th century. But there are others that someone who knows me as a public Catholic will be surprised. Confucius is there. A pair of British anthropologists, Victor and Edith Turner, who spent their whole life thinking and writing about African religious rituals, and Andrea Dworkin, of all people, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And so the book, each chapter of the book explores the question at hand through the life of this person, through the drama of a beginning, middle, and end, which is a genre that I kind of created and I find very attractive, and hopefully the reader will as well. But that you're absolutely right that there is this kind of ecumenical spirit to it. It's if you look there, you will definitely see the kind of Sohrab the controversialist, but it doesn't. I don't know. I don't hammer the reader in the way that I might a polemical target in one of my famous or infamous essays.
And you're not worried that people might now get the wrong idea about you? They might see this new Sohrab as gentle and
No. I mean, I look, a polemic is always a thing of the moment, whereas here I'm trying to transmit something long term, and so it just calls for it's not like I'm never going to write a polemical piece again or get into arguments on Twitter or whatever, but and I would argue that there's the same, frankly, anti-liberal subversiveness is present here too. Is just posed in a way where I hope a liberal can read it and say, oh yeah, there is this shortcoming in they're at the very least, if they're not a convinced post-liberal or what you may call it, at least makes them aware that there is some shortcomings in liberal ideology and that they're worth thinking about even from within the liberal frame if need be. But so it's worth my being gentle in that sense.
Sorry, what's really striking to me about the book, and I think even in your opening remarks here, outlining it, it gets at a kind of paradox. You even alluded to it just when you were talking about it. It's the paradox is, on the one hand, it's, I think, a very familiar worry about the future, and especially when one has kids, about the world that one is bequeathing to one's child, and the setting the child free into this world. But what's also striking to me, and is just that you said is, at the beginning of the book, you outline your own path to becoming the Sohrab that we all know, and the positions that you take, but also your personal journey, coming to America, and then your sense of rediscovering yourself. And you said, just now, how there's an element that you owe something to this kind of the ability that has, the kind of society that has allowed you yourself to sort of become who you are. Mm-hmm. So can I push you on that a little bit? I mean,
yeah,
it
looks like a paradox or a contradiction.
Well, a little bit. Was there any value for you? I mean, here's a narrower question: Is there value? Do you think there was any value to your journey of getting where you are today? Is there any intrinsic value in the path?
Oh, sure. I mean, let me answer that from a kind of merely personal and spiritual point of view. I'd say absolutely yes. There's famous Latin phrase, felix culpa, oh happy fault. That is, oh my fault, oh the fault of Adam, if you will, that made possible the redemption of mankind by Christ, which is all the more luminous, all the more glorious for the fact that it arises out of the fault of Adam, and that there's a higher kind of perfection achieved than would have been possible had there not been a fall in the first transgression in the garden. So felix culpa, and so to apply that to my own life, yes, I mean, if I look at my personal journey from this kind of confused, fresh off the boat, precocious teenager to where I am now, there's this beauty that's revealed, and I've written a spiritual memoir kind of describing or accounting for myself why I believe what I believe, and why, in 2016 I was received into the Roman Catholic Church. That said, from a point of view of a father, and therefore necessarily someone who is in a political community, first a family and then a larger political community extending to a nation and beyond, my concerns are different in the sense that first of all, it's not as if conversion journeys were unheard of in kind of pre-modern times. So I wouldn't rule out the fact that I may have taken a similar journey had we not, had we not as a civilization, had we not taken certain steps that I could view as mistakes. I may still have changed my mind, and I would have been allowed to change my mind otherwise. The other thing is, just because I sort of took this, what I view as a circuitous path to the wisdom of tradition, and specifically one tradition in particular, which happens to be sort of very universal tradition, just because I took a circuitous path doesn't mean that I would want a society that is a gauntlet of error that everyone has to go through, and that many people never quite make their way through. Their lives are plunged in material misery, which I think we should address, or moral degradations that are intrinsic to liberalism. And many, as I said, many never quite take the circuitous path at all. So it's worthwhile then to return to this older tradition of what it means to be free, which has always insisted, not just the Judeo-Christian tradition, but also the Greco-Roman, the classical tradition, that have always said freedom is not having maximal individual choice, but rather to be sufficiently master over yourself that you can literally govern yourself. So not only are you able to resist a tyrant, an external tyrant, but you master the interior tyrant, and you grow in virtue and become more detached from your baser appetites. And that's what it means to be really free. And this account of freedom is very comfortable with and accepts limits. And if you read the book, you'll see that although there are all these different questions and each one is explored through the life of this kind of disparate cast of characters from Aquinas to Andrea Dworkin, you notice that in each case you see the working out of the same paradox, where something that was imposed, if you will, by traditional societies and that looked like a limitation on choice and limitation on freedom, as it disappeared, as that limit was abolished, as that barrier was demolished, we find that we're not actually free, that it makes us less free. So in this sense, the book is very subversive, because what I'm proposing is that an entire account of freedom might be wrong, and that we may want to reconsider some real sort of epical choices that have brought us to the point we are. I sort of digressed from your original question, but I think I addressed it.
No, you did. Yeah. I mean, look, it's endlessly fascinating. That's why, I mean, I also, I echo Shadi that I think this was a book definitely worth reading and worth grappling on this, because I mean, I think both Shadi and I would, to a certain extent, I won't speak for Shadi, but I mean, the critique is I think is powerful and resonant, and I mean, in many ways, I think in different ways we are skeptical of many of the same sort of facets of sort of modern society. I guess the part that for me is interesting, and I'd like to maybe even tease out some more, is the difference. Well, it's partly the practicalities of it, because while I mean, it's not just a religious tradition. It's a secular philosophic tradition that's about self-mastery and placing limits upon oneself to truly appreciate freedom. And it's the practical application of that in society ultimately, right? And it's you have a chapter, for example, in there about the Sabbath and the importance of that. I mean, what do you think the actual implications of something like that, of a policy choice like that, are for a society as it is? I mean, I'm originally Croatian. I go back all the time.
Super Catholic society.
Super Catholic society, though. Again, super Catholic society emerging from decades of socialism, Yugoslav identity, all the rest of that. So also a kind of society that the identity becomes Catholic, but the practice and the day-to-day. I mean, maybe it's because my family is not particularly religious, but so I mean, I can't speak for all of Croatian society, but more broadly, also in a lot of ways, even though church is attended, it is also a little bit of going through the motions. I wonder, I mean, can you talk about that at least, and never mind Croatia, which maybe is a little exceptional in the European context, but say Italy, for example, a Catholic society, Austria, a Catholic society, where they have closed shops on Sunday, yet they're still suffering, I think, from a certain kind of spiritual malaise. Just to pick out one of the points that you're making on this, but maybe to stand in for a larger question of, modern societies and the problems inherent in modernity more broadly than just liberalism in sort of Western, and then what we're able to do about it.
So let me steer clear of Croatian history, but address your point more generally, which is well taken. Let me just begin on the Sabbath, and my argument in the Sabbath, if I can restage it or recapitulate it briefly here. Basically, I argue that the Sabbath is not only obviously a religious obligation, but that it's good for human beings, particularly working class people today, as a source of rest, frankly. And the practicality of it is not so strange or alien, or shouldn't be, to Americans, because America has had a Sabbatarian tradition going back before there was an American Republic in the colonies. So Sabbatarianism is the idea that the law should uphold one day as a day of rest and a day of worship. And not only in Puritan New England, which was obviously kind of a hyper-religious society, but also in supposedly more secular Virginia and in New Amsterdam, which becomes New York. In all of these places, the colonial authorities imposed a Sabbatarian requirements of one day, Sunday was set off for rest. And so we've had that tradition, and its disappearance is relatively recent. The last statewide blue law actually was repealed only in 2019, and that was in North Dakota. But across the 20th century, well into the 20th century, there are people who, within living memory, remember that malls used to be shuttered once a week, and various activities were set aside. So what's good about that, and why did particularly the labor movement, the nascent labor movement in the late 19th century begin aligning with the Protestant core of this country at the beginning of the late 19th century over the question of the Sabbath, is because it's not only it's good for people to leave one day for the things of God and for Scripture, but also because, as Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who's the subject of that chapter, says, you win interior liberty thanks to the Sabbath. That is, though you might spend 6 days a week in kind of acquisitiveness, in competition, in hard work, and those are good things, and those secure goods that are worthwhile. If you devote all your life to it, then you don't have a minute for setting aside this realm of space, as Rabbi Heschel says, the realm of economic and geopolitical conquest, the realm of competing with your neighbor, the realm of comparing yourself to the Joneses. In the realm of time, the realm of the Sabbath, for one day you sort of take a breath in the image of God's own taking a breath. And so you rest, you set those things aside, and you're reminded that that those aren't the only goods, that there are other goods. And it's especially good for working class people, but it's also, even for people in our lap type class, or whatever you want to call it, because we see that the loss of the Sabbath has left us harried and miserable. I see that myself, where there's not having that Sabbath spirit leaves me so restless, where if I'm having dinner with my family and my phone buzzes in my pocket, I can't help but kind of twitch with anxiety and the desire to look at what's in there on the phone. So that's all to say that there's a kind of setting aside its religious dimension. There's a temporal, a secular case for having a Sabbath. Now, let me just finish the thought, because I didn't fully answer his question. I know I give long, digressive answers. Luckily, this is one of those podcasts, but just very quickly. Demir says, so, having, for example, a Sabbath doesn't necessarily mean that you end up with a more deeply religious society. The answer I would give to that is that as a political Catholic, some people use the term integralism, but I use the term political Catholic, I'm okay with people going through the motions. In other words, I don't seek this idea that the ordinary person has to be like a monastic, a nun or a Dominican friar, like deeply engaged in prayer in the way that those figures might be. The whole idea of kind of Constantinian Christianity, and what the Constantinian conversion enabled, was that before that, Christianity, religion, was really for a kind of spiritual elite, people who could just withstand any persecution. The society was utterly opposed to them, but they sort of held on. Those people have a place in the life of the church and of Christian civilization. But there's also a place for the guy who, didn't know what all this stuff was about, but then the Constantinian conversion happens, and it becomes ordinary and for him to become a Christian. And now he may not deeply believe every element of the creed. He may not even understand it. He may have been offering sacrifices to the pagan deities a week earlier. Nevertheless, he's benefiting from the sacraments. He lives in an order now where you don't expose unwanted babies outside the city walls and leave them to die. And his faith may not be more than just going through the motions, and nevertheless, it's worthwhile. That is Christian civilization. That is Christian peoplehood. And so I think it's actually it is, again, a very kind of relatively modern understanding of the relationship between faith and civilization, where you say, like, I shouldn't need any social structural supports. I alone can just, through my own perfection, can just pursue God. And therefore, I don't need the laws to be supportive of a relatively kind of virtuous religious life.
Well, Sohrab, I'm glad you mentioned that this idea of going through the motions can actually be a good thing. And I think that in our modern rationalist society, we sort of dismiss it when people do things if they don't feel it. We want people to feel things and to get like emotional. And if they're not feeling it, then somehow it becomes a less valuable activity. And I think that even in an Islamic context, I've had conversations with, let's say, more progressive types who, even just more broadly, that questioning the point of prayer, if you're not actually if you're not kind of immediately feeling something, or if it's not giving you a boost, then what is actually the point of it? Is it a means or an end unto itself? And which gets, I think, to a really fundamental question about what the role of ritual in religion actually is. And I think from an Orthodox perspective, there's no doubt about it. If you're Muslim, you should be praying 5 times a day, regardless of how empty you feel or how pointless it seems to you, that you're just supposed to do it. And we did talk about some of that with Mustafa Akyol in a previous episode. This question of is there a rationale for religious acts that are secular, basically, or do you do things because you're supposed to obey God, so on and so forth? But the bigger question, to kind of to maybe take it one step further, from Demir's question about the role of the Sabbath, is when I was reading your book, I found myself a little bit torn in the sense that, as you know, so Rob, I sort of self-define as a liberal who is critical of liberalism. And I think that I share a lot of your diagnosis, a lot of your criticism, and I think Demir does, as he mentioned as well. But where I struggle again is not just on the Sabbath laws, but on the bigger question of what to actually do about this. Because if we take your critique on, it basically means that there's something fundamentally corrupt and rotten even about modern American liberalism. And here I'm not necessarily talking about left liberalism, although that's one strand, but the liberal idea more broadly. And if it has failed to this extent, if it is lacking to this degree, where a lot of us know that there's something wrong, we feel it. And I think this is where your critique has a kind of cross partisan appeal. I think most sentient beings know that something is wrong, something doesn't feel right. They might come to different conclusions about what that looks like, but I think that there aren't a lot of people who are incredibly optimistic about what American society currently is, or the majority of Americans, I think, would sympathize with the critique. But if the scale of the problem is so large and is so foundational, it would be great if we can talk a little bit about what can actually be done. So yes, the Sabbath has its place, even if it doesn't change society, or even if it's a relatively minor thing in the broader sweep of our current situation. It's good, yes, but it still leaves us with a kind of vacuum that isn't going to be addressed. So let's say that we start implementing blue laws in this country, i.e. Sabbath or Sunday laws. You're still going to have the majority of Americans who have drifted away from Christianity, drifted away from religion. They won't go to the mall. They won't go out, but they'll just go on Netflix, or they won't even be going through the motions in terms of recapturing something more important to them. They're just going to be doing whatever they would have done otherwise in a lot of these circumstances. Can you take us maybe a couple steps further? So let's say Sunday laws. What step 2, step 3, where you actually find ways to reduce or constrain freedom in a more serious, systematic way? Because you're not willing. You don't actually shy away from the idea that you are a political Catholic. You use the term political Catholicism. Others sometimes talk about Catholic integralism. Can you lay out for us what that looks like as a political program, if there are enough people who want to push it a step or two further?
Sure. I mean, I don't want to go down a kind of policy list. I guess we could, without laying out a comprehensive framework first. That is an account that would give coherence to any particular policy item that I might bring up. So one of them might be the restoration of the Sabbath. And again, I would very quickly say, for me, if restoring blue laws means that, a working class family can just spend time together, even if they spend that time not doing like what I would want them to do, I'd be fine with that. Like, I just think, Americans need rest, especially lower down the economic ladder. here's what I understand by political Catholicism, and I have a chapter on this. Chapter 6 in the book is, does God need politics? And it's explored through the life of perhaps the supreme political Catholic, Saint Augustine. The idea for me is that society, one way or another, will enshrine some account of the highest good of human life. And one way or another, some orthodoxy will be enforced. We see that undeniably over the past few years, whenever that you would say the point at which the replacement ideology, what Wesley Yang calls the replacement ideology, took over. Whether you think it's a distortion of liberalism or whether it's liberalism on hyperdrive, something happened over the past 2 years where it became clear that the promise of substantive neutrality as between comprehensive accounts of the good life was withdrawn. And this, to me, as a political Catholic, it was always clear that that promise was really an attempt to undermine the church in the public square, beginning with the kind of powdered wig liberals of the late 18th and throughout the 19th century, promising, just give us private space to believe what we believe, therefore sort of to diminish the church's claims on the public square. Now, having done that, liberalism in its more recent iterations has been very clear about imposing a definitively kind of orthodox account of what the good life is, and if you fall outside of it, you're banished from the public square. You're subject to all sorts of coercive measures. What that just shows us is that one way or another, some account of the highest good will be imposed, and the liberal idea of neutrality as between worldviews is just very hard to sustain in the face of the evidence of 2021. Now, I happen to believe the account of the highest good that our society enshrines is actually very destructive for individuals and communities. It leaves us less free in all sorts of ways, even though it happens to be an account that attaches itself to the honorable word liberty. Modern accounts of gender, right, is a sort of clear indication of this. Where what could be more liberating than to be able to override what your the sexed body that you receive from nature and impose through sort of medical technological will a different account of gender on the body that you receive from nature. What could be more liberating than that? Except in practice, it means that the politics of recognition demands that everyone else speak of you over against what reality tells them about what man and woman are, and to use like new pronouns that don't make sort of grammatical or logical sense. Or again, on the economic plane, the idea that liberating the individual actor would, allow us all to just sort of compete freely in the market and so forth. Well, in practice, it's turned out to be that, it favors very large corporations. It favors giganticism. And your free speech rights are now subject to the whims of these Silicon Valley impresarios. So I reject the account of the highest good that's enshrined by liberalism, even though it denies that it does any such thing. And I see that it's destructive. And so therefore I propose that society should enshrine the kind of foundational operating system of the West, which is Christianity, including in its natural law dimensions, which the church inherits from Greco-Roman civilization and incorporates into its moral teaching. It's a lot less crazy when a proposition once you realize that one way or another society will enshrine some orthodoxy or other. And this would be it's a much more humane one. It's one to which we owe a lot of the institutions that liberalism claims credit for, like the dignity of the individual, the importance of natural reason, the honor that we sort of give to natural reason, so on and so forth, and the sort of fundamental humaneness of it. So if that's the case, then we're now talking openly about and I'm very happy about this. We've gone through the stage where it's very obvious that we don't fall back to any of the old illusions about neutrality. It's very clear that some orthodoxy or other wants to lord it over us, and the question is which one. And if you recognize that, then political Catholic actors are happy to propose theirs in the public square.
But the orthodoxies aren't necessarily equal. So I certainly agree with you that the liberal orthodoxy that's now in cultural and political power is not neutral, and liberalism is only neutral to those who are already liberal. But at the same time, I wonder about the word coercion, and and the idea that this is a very coercive order, because there are certainly incentive structures to be more liberal or progressive on a number of these issues, including on gender, sexual freedom, so on and so forth. But ultimately, for the most part, the state isn't forcing me, certainly not me, as an individual, to be more liberal than I want to, or to believe things that I don't believe. I still have a wide berth to do the things that I want to do. And there are certain, you can still be an ultra conservative Muslim. There are Salafis, to use the Muslim example, there are Salafis in different parts of the US. There are ultra Orthodox Jews. It's hard to be that because you have a lot of choice and freedom. But ultimately, the freedom is still there to be Orthodox, to criticize the current liberal order. So I wonder, is it correct to draw an equivalency and say that liberals are coercive? So is it that different for Catholics to suggest their own potentially coercive ideas about the common good and to use the state to promote that? That might be more coercive.
Let me just piggyback on Shadi there. It's how do I put this? I found it really interesting what you're saying about natural law components and how that plays into liberalism. And again, I think Shadi and I both agree with you that something's gone wrong with this liberalism. But it seems to me that you're making a move at some point here that's saying, well, we're facing what I think we agree is a grotesque perversion facing us now, and that we're faced between two orthodoxies rather than trying to, I don't know, roll back to a kind of more humane pluralism, not to use the L word, liberalism, but a kind of pluralism, as opposed to coercion that Shadi's talking about. So I don't know if that also gives some more language that you might want to explore this stuff with.
Sure, those are both good points, and they blend well together. As far as whether or not non-liberal actors are in fact coerced in liberal societies, I feel like that's sort of an empirical judgment that you have to make, the judgment that I make, and I think a lot of religious intellectuals make nowadays, is that we are very much coerced. So you mentioned Salafis. I mean, obviously, insofar as Salafism is bound up with violent jihadism, it's coerced. But in Britain and increasingly, I think, in the United States, you'll find that what religious people get to teach their children is very much subject to regulation. Just a couple of weeks ago in Britain, an ultra-Orthodox Jewish day school was sort of written up, was reprimanded by the state for refusing to teach, the latest woke orthodoxies on gender and sexuality to children as young as basically grade school kids, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-olds. As you know, I mean, obviously the President Biden has vowed to renew his effort to force the Little Sisters of the Poor to pay for abortifacients. And a lot of the coercion under liberalism, besides those ones which are state-directed, you also are getting increasing coercion from private actors. And this is something that part of my whole critique of liberalism is that we are absolutely coerced, but the coercion is diffuse and is done by large corporations to which you don't have any kind of appeal. And yet, in order to be able to function as a public person, you have to rely on their services. So at the New York Post, we just went through kind of one of the most blatant cases of censorship for reporting something that we all know is true. That Hunter Biden tried to trade on his dad's cachet to arrange meetings between executives from the company that was paying him $50,000 a month and his father, who was then vice president of the United States and Obama administration's point man on Ukraine issues. And so not only was the story banned and reduced in circulation by Twitter and Facebook, but our account was suspended. And so you have a case where, for exercising a kind of a right that is a sacred right of journalism, the New York Post got barreled out of the public square, and lots and lots of journalists actually cheered the censorship. And it was all done by private actors. Of course, I could go out into the middle of Fifth Avenue and say, Hunter Biden is corrupt. But if these liberal rights live or die, they live or die on these platforms, and you see a shocking case in which the degree to which private actors can actually retract the fundamental promise of a free press. I could go on and on. I mean, I guess it's my mantra to a lot of people is when they say, "Is it really that coercive?" And I just say, look around you. I mean, I can't tell you the number of parents in New York City who come up to me and say that they're absolutely terrified of sort of woke indoctrination in their children's schools, and the fact that they can't say anything about it because at the end of the day they want their kids to graduate from school and go on to college. Anyway, I just think it becomes kind of pointless to say no, it is very coercive, and Shadi's like, well, is it that coercive?
That's a good point, and I'm glad you brought up a number of examples just so listeners can get a sense of what's actually at stake here. Although I suppose it does vary by locality and state. I mean, there are states that perhaps they don't go far enough in combating wokeness and the successor ideology and all that. But, in red states, there probably is less of that sense of being terrified. So I feel like this is in some sense more of a problem for people who decide to be in major urban centers and to live among other liberals. And, in New York City, let's say, or where I live in Washington, D.C., the vast majority of people are Democrats, are liberals, which gets to, I think, a different question of if the vast majority of people in major cities or in particular states want this, and they are liberals and they are sort of pushing their own, let's say, liberal or secular orthodoxy onto the state, onto the public educational curriculum, isn't that in some sense what we deserve as in democratic context? What majorities want on a local level tends to get reflected in various institutions, including in schools. And it's very hard to see how that would be undone as long as the vast majority of New Yorkers or Washingtonians are in fact wanting this and they're reflecting their preferences in the state. So some of this is also a question of how government institutions are responsive to their constituents. And if constituents become more Catholic or constituents find themselves in some sort of religious awakening, presumably then we would see a change and state institutions would reflect the more religious sensitivities of the people that they're serving, right?
I think a lot of the changes that you're describing are not a groundswell of changes that happened organically from below, but rather as a result and at the local level, but rather as a result of large-scale changes handed down by national and international elites. I mean, the obvious example is our abortion and gay marriage, neither of which was achieved by the ballot box, but rather was imposed sort of by judicial fiat. But I don't want to get into kind of the typical conservative argument about judges imposing this or that. My point is that the process of secularization that you described, if we take a longer view, I think is largely a result of legal and political developments. So in other words, it's not just that the culture organically changed in this way, but the law taught people to be a certain way. This is an insight, sort of axiomatic insight, that where I just sort of refer to Cicero or to Aristotle, where again we encounter the idea of the law as teacher. Therefore, what that means for me is that I don't put too much stock by what the shape of the culture is or what people think they've chosen, because I think a lot of these things that were unthinkable even 15 years ago, then became legally thinkable. And then suddenly people found themselves in response to the power of law being like, oh yeah, I've always been here. I mean, in the case of Obama with gay marriage, you saw it almost instantaneously, where he said, I've not instantaneously, but over a relatively short period of time, his views, quote unquote, evolved. And that's very typical of how people respond to sort of legal and political developments, so that they don't even remember that 2 weeks ago they held the contrary position. And if that's the case, then I wouldn't worry about then, is the culture with us on imposing natural law? It may not be, because I know that you can change the law, and often people will then find, as elites change and as the law changes, the masses will follow along.
That concludes part 1 of our interview with Sohrab Ahmari. I hope you guys will join us for part 2, which is for paying members only. If you're not a paying member, please go to wisdomofcrowds.live/subscribe, and you will get access to not just all of our bonus episodes, but also special written content, part of which every Friday, Shadi and I alternate to write an essay. If you'd like access to all of that, please subscribe. Thanks a lot.